Many people get to see exciting things in their lives. I'm the boss at an insurance office, and I've also seen interesting stuff in my 30 years of working. In my office, one wall is made of glass. This lets me see everyone who comes into the insurance company. I like to look at the faces of new customers before talking to them. I decide what kind of people they are before they say anything to me. I learned to trust my first feelings about people. I want to tell a story about a man who came into the company one day. I watched him through the glass in my office. He looked about 40 years old and was dressed very nicely. He seemed very polite and appeared to be a true gentleman. He was talking to one of the clerks. Even though he looked okay, I didn't like him when I first saw him. Suddenly, he saw me looking at him. He smiled at me through the glass. Then he took some papers from the clerk and left. A few minutes later, I called the clerk into my office and asked, "Who was that man?" "That was Mr. Marcus Thompson, sir," the clerk told me. "He's from the Middle Temple." "What did he want?" I asked. "He wanted one of our insurance forms," the clerk replied. "He said that a friend of yours recommended this company." "He knew my name then, did he?" "Oh yes, Mr. Sampson," the clerk confirmed. "He knew your name." About 2 weeks later, I went to have dinner with a friend. Mr. Marcus Thompson was one of the other guests. He was standing near the fire, saw me, and asked our host to introduce him to me. Our host quickly brought him over. The three of us started talking. "I thought you knew Mr. Sampson already," our host said. "No," Mr. Thompson told him. "I followed your suggestion. I went to the insurance office, but I didn't talk to Mr. Sampson. I didn't want to bother him." "Did you go there to get an insurance plan?" I asked Mr. Thompson politely. "Was it a life insurance plan?" "It's not for me," Mr. Thompson said. "It's for a friend of mine. He wanted me to get the details for him. I don't know if he'll get the plan. People often change their minds, don't they, Mr. Sampson?" "Yes," I replied. We started talking about other things. "Your job has had a big loss," Mr. Thompson said suddenly. I didn't know what he meant. "A loss?" I asked in surprise. "What kind of loss, sir? A money loss?" Mr. Thompson laughed. "I don't mean a money loss," he explained. "I was talking about Mr. Anderson." Now I understood. "Ah, yes, Mr. Anderson," I agreed. "That was a sad loss. He was the smartest man I've ever known in the insurance business." "But did you know Mr. Anderson?" I asked. "I knew about him," Mr. Thompson told me. "What a sad story. A young man like that suddenly quits his job and withdraws from the world. I had mentioned earlier that I didn't like Mr. Thompson when I first saw him in the insurance office. I still didn't like him. I didn't believe he was truly sad about Mr. Anderson. I decided to ask Mr. Thompson some questions to learn more about him. "Do you know why Mr. Anderson left his job?" I asked. "I've only heard rumors," he said. "It seems Mr. Anderson was unhappy in love." "That's not true," I told him. "The truth is that the lady passed away." "She died, did she?" Mr. Thompson repeated. "That's terrible. Poor Mr. Anderson. How very sad for him." I still felt that Mr. Thompson wasn't being honest. There was something not quite true in the way he looked sad. Then he said to me, "You're surprised that Mr. Anderson's story affects me so much. I can see that, Mr. Sampson, but I, too, have had a very sad time lately. I have two nieces, you know. One of them, a girl of 23, passed away not long ago. The other niece is also not doing well. The world is a very sad place." Now I thought I understood Mr. Thompson. He was a caring man who had experienced hardship. I was upset with myself for not liking him. I observed him for the rest of the evening, and he seemed like a good person. He spoke politely to everyone, and everyone seemed to like him. I decided that my first feeling about Mr. Thompson was mistaken. I talked to our host about Mr. Thompson. He told me that he hadn't known him for very long. Mr. Thompson had taken his two nieces to Italy for their health. It was there that one of them had passed away. After that, he came back to England with his other niece. Now I felt like I understood Mr. Thompson. I felt sorry for not trusting him before. 2 days later, I was sitting in my office as usual. I saw Mr. Thompson come into the outer office. The moment I saw him, I didn't like him again. Mr. Thompson waved happily at me and entered my office. "I've come back," he said, "because I want to find out what my friend did with the insurance forms. I want to know if he sent them back to the company. His family is worried about him, you know. They want him to get a good insurance policy." "Maybe I can help," I said. "What's your friend's name, Mr. Thompson?" I asked him. "Reynolds," he told me. I called the clerk into my office. I asked him to check if a man named Reynolds had started an insurance policy with the company. The clerk looked through his files for a bit and then brought me some papers. "Yes, Mr. Sampson," he said. "We got these forms from Mr. Reynolds. He wants a policy for £2,000 and has asked Mr. Thompson to write a reference for him." "Me?" exclaimed Mr. Thompson in surprise. He thought for a moment. "But of course, I can do that for him." Mr. Thompson sat down in my office and wrote the reference for Mr. Reynolds. He left the forms in my office, said goodbye politely, and then left. Mr. Thompson wasn't the only person who visited me that day. Very early that morning, someone else visited me at my house. It was a very private visit, and nobody knew about it. Mr. Reynolds's insurance policy started in March. I didn't see Mr. Thompson again for 6 or 7 months. In September, when I went to Scarborough, I saw Mr. Thompson walking on the beach. It was early evening, and he greeted me warmly. Mr. Thompson was with a young lady, his niece, Miss Niner. He introduced me to her, saying she was his niece. Her name was Miss Niner. I looked at her closely and noticed that she didn't look very well. As we walked along the sand, Mr. Thompson pointed to some tracks. He laughed. "Your shadow has been here again," he joked to Miss Niner. "Shadow? What shadow?" I asked. "My uncle is joking, Mr. Sampson," she explained. "There is an elderly gentleman here in Scarborough. He travels around in a hand carriage. I see him so often that my uncle calls him my shadow." As she spoke, we saw the old man's hand carriage coming our way. There was a frail old man inside, and as the carriage passed us, he waved his arm at me and called my name. I went to see what he wanted, leaving Mr. Thompson and Miss Niner for about 5 minutes. "My niece is quite curious," Mr. Thompson told me when I rejoined them. "She wants to know who her shadow is." "His name's Major Banks," I told him. "He's a very rich man, but a very sick one. He was just telling me how much joy you both bring him. He says it's clear that you are very fond of each other." "It's true, we are very close," Mr. Thompson said very seriously. "We are alone, you know, since Margaret died." Miss Niner looked sad at her uncle's words. The memory of her sister was still very painful for her. Suddenly she sat down near a rock on the beach, looking pale. Mr. Thompson walked away from us. He too seemed very upset by his memories. Miss Niner began to tell me about her uncle. She said he was a very good, kind man. She told me that she knew she was going to die soon. She was worried about what would happen to her uncle when she died. As she was talking, I saw the hand carriage coming back towards us along the sand. Suddenly, I interrupted her. "Miss Niner," I said urgently, "I have something important to tell you. You are in great danger. You must come with me and talk to that man in the hand carriage. Your life depends on it." Miss Niner was very shocked by my words. I walked with her to the hand carriage before she had time to object. I did not stay with her for more than 2 minutes. Within 5 minutes, I saw her walking up the beach with a gray-haired man. He had a slight limp. I knew that she was safe with that man. I went back to the rock and sat down. Mr. Thompson came back soon afterward. He was surprised that his niece had gone. We talked for a few minutes. He told me that Miss Niner was very ill, and he looked sad while he told me. I replied politely to everything he said, but I was holding a weapon in my pocket as we walked along together. "Mr. Sampson, can I ask you something?" he suddenly asked. "What's the news about that poor man Anderson? Is he dead yet?" "No," I told him. "He's not dead yet, but he won't live long, I'm afraid." What a sad place the world is. Mr. Thompson sighed quietly. It was November before I saw Mr. Thompson again, this time in London. I had a very important appointment at Middle Temple. I arrived at the temple and went up some stairs. There were 2 doors at the top of the stairs. The name Reynolds was painted on one door, and the name Thompson was painted on the other. I went through the door marked Reynolds. The room was messy, and there were empty bottles everywhere. A young man got up when I entered. He walked very unsteadily and seemed drunk. "Thompson's not in yet," he said loudly. "I'll call him." He went into the corridor and began to shout. "Hey, Marcus, come in here and have a drink," he called. Mr. Thompson entered the room and was very surprised to see me. "Marcus, this is Mr. Sampson." Reynolds introduced us. "Boil the brandy, Marcus," he said, handing Mr. Thompson a dirty saucepan. "Come on, boil the brandy the way you usually do." Mr. Thompson seemed uncomfortable with my presence in the room, I could tell. "How is your niece, Mr. Thompson?" I asked him quietly. "I'm sorry to say my niece has left me," he replied. "She went away without a word of explanation." Reynolds held out the saucepan once more. "Boil the brandy, Marcus," he repeated. "Give me what you always give me for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Boil the brandy, I'm telling you." Now, Mr. Thompson looked even more embarrassed. This was an uncomfortable situation for him. He thought for a moment and then spoke to me. "You're a man of the world, Mr. Sampson," he began. "I'll tell you the truth." "No, Mr. Thompson," I said firmly. "You'll never tell the truth. I know all about you." "You want to save your insurance company some money," he said calmly. "You'll try to argue that I was responsible for Reynolds's condition and for his eventual death. But you won't be able to prove that, you know. You won't be able to prove anything." Reynolds suddenly picked up his brandy glass and threw it at Mr. Thompson. The glass cut his forehead, and blood started to flow down his face. Mr. Thompson took out his handkerchief and dried his face. While he was doing this, another man came into the room, a man with gray hair who walked with a slight limp. Mr. Thompson looked at this man in surprise. "Look very carefully at me," Reynolds cried out. "You're a rogue, Thompson, and I've caught you. I took these rooms on purpose, just to catch you. I pretended to be a drunkard to catch you, and I've done it. You'll never escape now. You see, the last time you went to see Mr. Sampson, I had already been to see him myself. I went to his house very early that morning. We know everything. We know what you were planning. You thought you could harm me for the £2,000 from the insurance policy, right? You wanted to harm me with brandy, didn't you? But you wanted me to die quickly. That's why you also gave me small amounts of poison. Mr. Thompson was surprised by Reynolds's behavior. The young man didn't seem drunk now. At first, Mr. Thompson didn't know how to react. Then he found his courage. He was very pale but looked coldly at Reynolds. He didn't say a word. I took these rooms on purpose, Reynolds continued. I knew what kind of man you are, you see. You're the man who's already harmed one innocent girl for her money. And now you're slowly harming another one. Thompson laughed. Think about how foolish you are. Reynolds continued. You thought I was drinking brandy all day, but I threw most of it away. You never knew that I came into your room at night when you were asleep. I took all your papers, Thompson. I read your journal, too. It has all the information about the poisons that you use. It explains everything. I know where the journal is now. Thompson looked at Reynolds questioningly. It's not in your desk, Reynolds told him. Then you're a thief, Thompson said calmly. He spoke calmly, but his face was white. I'm your niece's shadow, Reynolds said quietly. Suddenly, Thompson lost his calm and his courage. He looked frightened now. Still, he said nothing. I've watched you all the time, Reynolds said. I knew that you were poisoning Miss Niner. I went to Mr. Sampson and told him everything. The man standing at the door is Mr. Sampson's servant. The three of us have saved your niece's life. Reynolds paused for a moment to look at Thompson. Then he went on. You don't even know my real name, he said very quietly. You asked Mr. Sampson several times if he had any news about Anderson. I can give you news about him. I am Anderson, he declared triumphantly. I loved your niece Margaret. I could not save her, but I promised to pursue you to the end. And I've done it, he cried. I've hunted you down, Thompson. Thompson now looked in horror at the man who was accusing him. He was unable to speak for fear. You never knew my real name, Anderson told him. You are seeing me under my real name now for the first time. You will see me again when you answer the charge of murder in court, and I hope you see me in your imagination when they put the rope around your neck and the crowd cries out for your death. Thompson turned quickly away from us for a second and put his hand to his mouth. The room suddenly filled with the smell of some chemicals. Thompson gasped, ran a few steps, and fell to the floor. He was dead. Anderson and I made sure that Thompson was dead. Then we left the room together. I have done what I promised to do, Anderson said sadly to me. My life is ended now. I did everything that I could to help him, but the poor man died a few months later.